Hello and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is the Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra information tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of this war and what is going on in the wider region, indeed the world. Where should we go to first? Well, actually, some potentially very bad news coming from Bakhmut at the moment. Here's my Bakhmut map. I don't usually do a frontline update in these ones, but I'm just going to give you a couple of nuggets of information that may or may not be true, but if they are true, it's bad news. So OSINT Defender says a Czech volunteer has said this on the Bakhmut front. So this is just coming out now. I'm squatting on the battalion staff right now, so I'll throw you some info. Klishchivka is not ours anymore. We lost a lot of great fighters on it. Anyway, despite what happened there, we keep going. We don't give up. The fighting spirit doesn't drop, and we are ready to continue to carry out the combat assignments. Null report says, despite all the emotion, Solidar is tactically uninteresting. Ukraine controls a higher ground to the north, making further Russian advances difficult. What worries me more is the situation around Klishchivka, which has deteriorated. The village is likely in Russian hands. That's a couple of bits of bad news, but also possibly Sil. So Wagner forces are now claiming to have captured the town of Sol to the north of Bakhmut. The picture was said to have been taken a few years ago in front of the town hall, although I think that's actually goes on to say it appears to be in front of the train station, which is in the center of Seoul, or Sil, as it's sometimes called, I think. If Seoul has indeed been captured, this essentially cuts off Bakhmut from the city of Siversk, utilizing the T0513 highway. So what this looks like, potentially, but grain of salt and all that, what it looks like is Klishchivka, the village might have been lost, but that doesn't necessarily mean the high ground behind it, which is kind of the difficult area to take. However, that will be a huge loss for the Ukrainians. I mean, for all that to go in one day would be kind of bizarre. So possibly, I don't know. It's just a rumor at the end of the day, or an unverified claim, I should say. In Solidar, the idea is that this entire area has been lost, or at least the train station, but possibly all of it. Depending on how, what the range of these claims suggests, or whether they are indeed true at all. So it's difficult to know. And then you hear this, but this looks like it's probably come out from earlier today. Let's just read you what this guy says. An update from Bakhmut Solidar today. I'll try and be quick with this guy. So he says, good morning. Friends, what is happening in the hottest area of the frontline Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts? The information war is unfortunately happening not only on the battlefield, but more in the heads of our people. And a lot of work needs to be done to improve this. As thousands of people like me are doing our work on the front line and doing it very well, especially the infantry that's holding off the horde with titanic efforts. But unfortunately, on the informational front, we are losing in places because our people believe in some lies and BS. In short, on Solidar, do not expect any panic. The city is rather small. The occupiers are having, quote, gigantic success there. He's obviously being a little bit sarcastic. Forget it. Remember where they were. They were near Kyiv. They were in Kherson. They captured Kharkiv Oblast. Where are they now? The fact that they were killing one battalion per day and completely devastated the city, there's no point for us to be there. We need to preserve experienced infantry, brave infantry. Believe me, not everyone will have the bravery to fight in close combat like our infantry does. I'll say from the experience, I spent 2 months in the eastern direction in Bakhmut on the first rotation near the asphalt factory. It's not as easy as it may seem. I'm sure it isn't. Friends, regarding Bakhmut, the situation there is much better. Bakhmut is under serious shelling. Serious as always, just the intensity is higher with artillery mortars, MLRS, aviation, again trying to break the defense with masses of our infantry like in Solidar. They need to show another victory over tiny towns. but Bakhmut is holding, it's standing. Don't spread panic, be careful and watchful. Bakhmut is holding, it's standing. Bakhmut is Ukraine. The Ukrainian flag is there and Ukrainian units. Friends, everything will be Ukraine. Our commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny, knows what he's doing. This is almost the most important part of what he says right at the end here. He says, if I can get it, everything that's happening at Soledar and Bakhmut is not for no reason. The general staff will not tell you a lot of information that you don't need. You know the information that you need to know. Bakhmut is holding. That's all. Which is in contradiction to what you just heard from some of those other sources, or at least he just talking about Bakhmut. So he's talking about the city of Bakhmut, not necessarily really talking about Soledar, about Sol or Sil, not talking about Klishchivka. Just Bakhmut is holding, and it's the idea that this is a tiny place, in the whole grand scheme of things, and they will claim a gigantic victory, but it's just not how it works. Where would they? When they were around Kharkiv, where were they when they were in Kherson? They've been beaten back, and I suppose the implication here is they'll get beaten back again. So who knows exactly what's happening, but I would say there has been, it appears to me, at least quite a quick amount of territory taken by the Russians, considering what's happened over the past sort of months. They definitely have some kind of momentum. I know that artillery is presently hitting back in Solidar at the moment in terms of hitting ammunition depots. So I think 3 have been hit that I know of, and here we see ammunition dump being hit by artillery and being taken out. So as I say, but at least 3 ammunition dumps taken out around there. So they'll be doing their stuff, the artillery, but it's not looking great around Bakhmut. I don't think it doesn't take a genius to know that, but it's just, again, as I keep saying, it's where to now. Do they have enough to keep this momentum going? Can they take anything other than these small towns? There's a lot of people. I mean, someone on my thread today was saying, well, it's just one step to Kramatorsk, and then it's a straight line of basically no defense to Kyiv. And you're thinking, do you know how long it's taken you guys to take Bakhmut? I mean, this is absolutely ridiculous that you think that if Bakhmut falls, then suddenly Kramatorsk is going to fall, and then from Kramatorsk, it's one line of no defense to Kyiv. Like, Kyiv's over here. What are you talking about? But that's Russian bots for you. It's just absolute nonsense. We're talking about a tiny amount of area around here that the Ukrainians are definitely being put on the back foot in defending, but it doesn't mean that Kramatorsk will fall, and it doesn't mean that Seversk will fall next, just like dominoes. This will be difficult for the Ukrainians. In light of all of this, there has been lots of promise about tech going or equipment going to different places. So we have here announced today, on top of what we already knew, 14, which is 14 Challenger 2 tanks and the AS-90 guns. First, there will be 8, so these are self-propelled guns, and then another 22 later. The UK also sends hundreds of armoured vehicles, including the updated FV432. That's a Bulldog. So the Bulldog is an old bit of kit, but there, as with all these things, there are updates. It's been used since 1963 to now, so it's a bit like the M113 in my opinion. It will have limited use. You're not going to throw it on a front line. It's an APC, probably going to be used to move people around from city to front line or whatever. It's not going to be involved in, I assume, in offensive maneuvers. But that's great to be giving hundreds of them. And of course, Challenger 2 and AS-90. So the UK has stepped up today. Interesting, 19 ex-Danish Piranha 3 APCs, armored personnel carriers, being delivered to Moldova by Germany as part of the military support package from Germany. So that's pretty interesting. Denmark announced in April 2022 it would donate a number of Piranha 3 to Ukraine, about 20 to 25, but this was blocked by Switzerland in June. So Switzerland blocked these going to Ukraine. So Denmark originally had 92 Piranha 3s. The Piranha 3 were extensively used in Iraq and Afghanistan and now being replaced by the Piranha 5 in the Danish army. The 19 Piranha 3 may have been acquired by Germany for the donation to Moldova since the German Minister of Defence's visit in October 2022. However, these are not necessarily the same APCs as originally planned Danish APCs for Ukraine. So it may or may not be that these were stopped from going to Ukraine and they've been sent instead to Moldova, or it just might be something different. Who knows? And Moldova is the nation next to Ukraine. So you've got Transnistria, which is this kind of breakaway region or region that Russia has taken control of, not too dissimilar to the Donbass, I guess, uh, which, Ukraine have been worried about whether Russia could stage attacks from Transnistria. There just aren't enough Russian troops there to do anything meaningful. Uh, but it is interesting that Germany is supporting uh, the Moldovans here in giving them a military package. Good stuff. So, staying on this kind of APC infantry fighting vehicle equipment being sent to Ukraine, let's look at this. I watched this so the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. So these are APCs with guns on, basically. I watched this Bradley training video and it made me happy. So these are Ukrainians being trained on a Bradley. At 4 seconds in this video, we see the squad leader's computer. Here's why I'm excited. So notice that squad leader computer. This is why he's excited. It has a map, and the squad leader can understand where the squad is. You can see elevation, and if it's networked with other brads, you can see where your other platoon's brads are. This helps to avoid friendly fire and greatly enhances combined arms operations. So important for the Ukrainians, very much lacking with the Russians. You can switch the view between driver, gunner, and commander sites. The squad leader can use IBAS, improved Bradley acquisition subsystem, to scan the terrain for potential cover and enemy positions and share with the squad. All under the protection of Bradley's armor. The situational awareness provided by the computer is instrumental for the successful combination arms operations. Soviet era BMPs have nothing like that, and this is a substantial upgrade for Ukrainian armed forces. Squad and its leader has access to all the night and thermal vision optics of the Brad commander, driver, and gunner. It's significant for all the operations, even during the day, because thermal vision allows the squad to identify targets under the protection of the armor. This is again the difference in equipment. Ukraine are getting upgraded, Russia consistently being downgraded. And this is a problem going forward for the Russians. I'm absolutely positive. Breaking news here on equipment donations and the idea that a lot of European nations are trying to give Ukraine Leopard tanks, and Leopard are saying, Germany are saying, no, we're not going to allow export of them at the moment. And there's a lot of pressure on Germany, and their defense ministers just resigned, and we'll see what's going to go on there. But the State Duma deputy, so this is back in Russia, Lieutenant General Andrei Gurilev has said, as soon as German tanks appear in on Russian territory, so this is like a bit of a diss to the UK, which is like, you provided 12 Challenger tanks, meh, whatever, not really interested. But as soon as German tanks appear on Russian territory, Russia will have no choice but to announce a general mobilization. To me, this is interesting. First of all, it's the use of the term Russian territory. So, yeah, what does that exactly mean? And also, this is just an excuse for a general mobilization. This will be a justification. This is a justification they need to say to the Russian public, "Oh, we're going to do a general mobilization, the whole mobilization of the whole country." This is a fascinating statement here, and really super important. And obviously, it's intended to stop Germany doing that. It's a deterrent, but whether it will work, I don't know. We'll have to see from Germany. Now, to remain on the subject of infantry fighting vehicles in particular, but equipment being given to Ukraine, as many of you will already know because you would have watched Perun, but Perun has an absolutely phenomenally excellent, superb channel that gives you sort of weekly deep dives into different subjects. And his most recent one, I think it's his most recent one, is about infantry fighting vehicles and looking at the Oryx figures for them and and other sort of stats that you can get hold of. Now, Oryx is the best source for accumulating. I forget the word, MS brain there. Putting together all the stats for Russian losses, Russian damaged vehicles, Russian captured vehicles, and other equipment, and the Ukrainian equivalent. And this is done through visual confirmation. It's incredibly time consuming because they now have to like triple check whether they have, duplicated pieces of equipment that have been lost, and then someone takes a picture from it from a different angle, and then tries and say, here's another tank that's been blown up, and all these sorts of things. So it is a time consuming process, and they produced the stats that broadly look like this. Russia's lost 8,708 pieces of equipment, and you can split that down into tanks, IFVs, and so on and so forth. Ukraine have lost 2,804. So something like 3 to 4 times fewer pieces of equipment. Russia has lost 3 to 4 times more stuff, and that's been fairly consistent actually throughout the entire war. And then the Russians come back with lots of counterclaims, and Perun sort of looks at this data and says, "Well, what does it tell us? How do we best interpret this data?" And some really fascinating conclusions. So some of the sort of pro-Russian voices will say, "Oh, essentially Ukraine has lost the same amount as Russia or more. It's just that these figures are bogus or whatever." But the claim is that Ukraine has actually lost more. And that's actually impossible. Is literally that claim is physically impossible. And the reason it's physically impossible is because if Ukraine were to lose the amount of absolutely verified losses, so this is the total conservative lowest case scenario that Russia has lost. So they have lost more than this, but these are the ones that are visually confirmed. There are lots more to be confirmed that are out there that haven't been found, but these are absolutely visually confirmed. Now, if Ukraine had lost that amount, it's impossible because they literally have never had that amount of stuff. Okay, they have gained some, they've been given stuff, but in general, when you look at the statistics, if you are a Russian saying Ukraine have lost the same or more equipment than Russia, that is physically impossible. They have not got the capability to lose that amount of equipment, certainly in some of the sub sort of categories. So that's interesting. And then Perun looks at what type of equipment Russia have predominantly lost compared to the Ukraine, and it turns out that Russia has lost a higher proportion of newer equipment than Ukraine, apart from in some very particular categories. And Ukraine has lost more older equipment. So that's pretty interesting. Here, the Russian losses, some of the key sort of findings here. You've got BTRs, BMPs. These are sort of infantry fighting vehicles. BTRs, I think, are wheeled vehicles. Um, as you've lost some of the slightly newer variants, 29% as opposed to BMP2, 23%. BMP1, they've actually discussed that in a separate section. Is a bit of an outlier. I mean, they've got an awful lot of BMP1s, then they sort of got loads of mothballing and all sorts of stuff. Um, uh, and this fascinating statistic: 221 command and control vehicles, right? And 94 of them were captured. The equivalent Ukrainian losses is 8. And that is huge. The difference between these command and control vehicles lost between the two sides is incredible. And that must tell you something and must be indicative of some kind of difference in how these things have been lost and what's going on with the two armies. And this must surely track with troops lost as well. So my add-on to this is that this has to give you some indication. There are people in these vehicles quite often, not all the time. A lot of them have been abandoned, and I've talked about that previously. But there are often people in these vehicles, and this this will also indicate that these vehicles are lost during attacks and encounters. Again, not all the time. There will be lots of abandoned, but i- considering that, you would assume that therefore, well, it is sensible to assume, I would think, until proven otherwise, that this would also reflect the Russians losing more casualties than the Ukrainians. And yet, still, you get the Russian narrative throwing out the Ukrainians are losing 4 times as many as the Russians. And it's just not the case, especially since we know the amount of convicts that have been thrown into the Wagner lines, and we know the amount of mobilized people that have been thrown into the front lines as well, along with the existing Russian army, and they're still advancing only in very small amounts and at huge cost. So I would say that uh, this is, I mean, I would say go and watch this video. It's really, really interesting. But I think it is also indicative of Russia suffering a lot more losses than Ukraine in general. Ukrainian figures follow different patterns than the Russian ones, wheeled versus tracked. So, a difference between wheeled and tracked vehicles. There's a slant towards older material, uh, but losses in the very latest wheeled systems is relatively heavy. So, and he talks about that. And, well, he thinks he's got a. He doesn't actually talk about that. He thinks he's got a theory for that, but he wants to test it with experts first. So there is some interesting sort of difference in figures, but well worth looking at. Lots of conversation or lots of analysis that he gives. And there are sort of outliers to these. Talks about how the losses have, and I showed you these figures as well, how the losses have affected the comparison between the two forces and how this has brought the forces much closer together in certain categories. And there is a greater parity of mechanized capability now. Uh, but yeah, well worth watching that video. I'd love to play you loads of little nuggets from there, but maybe I will pick out a few someday. And again, always worth checking out what Oryx has to show. If we just look at, say, tanks, let's go down to, goodness me, well, these are the tanks here. So we have tanks, 1,614 tanks, of which 947 have been destroyed, 73 damaged, 59 abandoned, and 535 captured. Now, Perun also talks about how captured doesn't necessarily mean they automatically go to the other side and are used by the other side. Some of them are captured, but they're in such bad nick that they may be cannibalized for parts, or they take months and months to get up to spec, or they're really not good enough to be brought up to spec. And so, although you might think, oh, they've captured 535, they've got more tanks now than they started with, the Ukrainians. Actually, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Okay, let's move on. We're going to talk about Gary Kasparov, who is the former chess grandmaster or whatever from Russia, and he is in exile now. But some people are saying, he should be, if anything goes left field for the Russian administration, he should be part of it. He's got the right kind of mind and sort of touted for politics. Maybe, who knows? But he certainly is one to follow on places like Twitter and in the media in general. So a few comments that he said in this Der Spiegel article. It's war. You're either on one side of the front or the other. Every Russian citizen, including me, bears collective responsibility for this war. But it's not the same with personal responsibility. Russia today is a fascist dictatorship that is committing crimes against humanity as we speak. And everyone who is still in Russia now is part of this war machine, whether they want to be or not. You can't just, he's talking about people leaving the country, Russians leaving the country. You can't just let people travel back and forth. There was no German tourism in London in 1941 either. So I proposed welcoming only those Russians who sign a declaration with three principles. One, the war is criminal. Two, the Putin regime is illegitimate. And three, Ukraine is indivisible. So that's an interesting idea, and getting people to, if you want to travel outside your country, you need to commit to what we think is the proper approach to understanding Ukraine and its sovereignty and understanding what Russia is doing. Putin's military and economic capacities will have been exhausted by spring. So this is a pretty big claim. He'll run out of munitions by April at the latest, and the economy it won't even be able to cover the basic needs of the Russians. That's why Putin is in a hurry. He is trying to establish a good starting point for negotiations. Again, that's a big claim. It's this last one that I find more interesting. He's trying to establish a good starting point for negotiations. So could there be this real drive to get some things achieved, so he can finally say, because there have been these little signposts to Putin being open for negotiations. Kind of the claim that, oh, Ukraine aren't up for negotiations, which is a way of saying we're ready, and trying to blame Ukraine for not doing them, but also sending out other little signs to say, they're getting towards negotiation time. At least that's my thought. Kasparov continues later. It is well known that dictators don't like losers, and Putin is about to lose a war. Who else does he have? Iran has other problems right now. China is doing nothing for Putin. Kazakhstan has turned its back. Support is shrinking by the day. Even Serbia refused to recognize the so-called referendums. Putin is alone, and and that's worth considering as well. I think Iran um, is interesting because they've become like best mates type thing, but Iran's in a pretty precarious position themselves at the moment. So it's not that he's got reliable friends and allies there. Later on in the interview, he says, if we don't manage to return to Europe, we will become a satellite state of China. So he's talking about Russia. Um, if cutting ties with the West, going to war with Ukraine, becoming a pariah state, it means that they will become a satellite state of China. Beijing is just waiting for Russia to collapse. This is something I've been saying for ages, which is I think China will benefit more if Russia loses than if Russia wins. They win either way, China, but I think you can almost imagine China wanting Russia to lose. They might be ideologically tied, but from a kind of economic and power base sort of point of view, I think China will definitely welcome Russia collapsing because they'll just go in and pick up the pieces. Oh, yeah, we'll help you get on your feet. We'll have a piece of those natural resources, and we'll have our business helping you here and there, and we'll have a lot of this global warming. The tundra is warming up. No permafrost. Okay, let's have some crops growing there for China. Thank you very much, and all this sort of carry on. Beijing is just waiting for Russia to collapse. Demographically and economically, that is the biggest threat to our existence. According to official Chinese historiography, nearly half of Russia's territory is actually China. And this is the idea that if Russia falls apart, yeah, we'll have back some of these eastern provinces and regions. So yeah, really worth reading this article. There's a lot more there. I've just picked out a few parts to discuss. But yeah, go and find Der Spiegel and look up everyone who is still in Russia is part of this war machine. That's the title of the article. And finally, a little thread. Just make sure I've got enough time. Yeah, good thread by Tatarigami. Now, I read out this thread, which is casting aspersions on the claim that Russia is running out of munitions. And Michael Kaufman, who is another person well worth following, who he is director of Russia studies at CNA, senior junk fellow at the CNAS, and follows Russian military capabilities, operations, and strategy, and so on. So he's replying to Tatarigami, who was saying that Russia aren't going to run out of munitions. It's not quite what CNN and other analysts are claiming. So Kaufman says, yeah, good thread, yeah, interesting, but important to parse questions of logistics disruption. So there was talk in this Tatarigami thread, and I read that to you the other day, as I say, that was more to do with not so much the production, the ability to produce shells and ammunition, but the ability to move them around. And those are two different things. Questions of logistics disruption and RU adjustment with assessments of fire rate, available stocks, and production rates. Several factors can be relevant, making it difficult to discern which is more causal. So, are we conflating Russian logistics disruption with Russia running out of ammo? My sense is that Russian adjustment to logistics disruption has probably been more successful than commonly discussed, but the ammo depletion remains an important factor to watch for in 2023. You can debate which is more causal of a decline in Russian fire rates. So this is the idea that at the moment Russia appear to be firing 75% less on average artillery rounds than they were, months ago at the height of what they were doing. And what explains this? And most analysts are saying it's because they can't produce enough shells. They're running out of stocks. They're actually using some really old stocks that are pretty dodgy that you wouldn't use unless you're really desperate. All these kind of things. So some people are saying that the fire rates is to do with the production and the unsustainable rate of firing, whereas Tatarigami said no, it's because of logistics that they're firing fewer rounds. So, and you can debate which is more causal of a decline in Russian fire rates. One, rationing due to dwindling stocks. Two, lower intensity of fighting and a reduced front line. So this is also something Tatragami says. The front line is a lot smaller, so they're firing fewer shells. I'd say it shouldn't make much difference. They'll just use the same amount of howitzers in a smaller area and do even more damage. And three, logistics disruption, or assume it's a multi-causal and all of the above are important factors, quite possibly. The artillery fire rate discussion has always suffered from input-output problems. If RU logistics were so poor, then how could they reach peak fire rates of 40,000 per day during the summer and 60,000 according to less realistic estimates? The claimed 20,000 average per day over spring summer doesn't align well with the narratives that terrible Russian logistics due to lack of mechanization, etc., were a major impediment. You can argue that it hampers distributed logistics, but even so, the evidence is questionable. Furthermore, post mobilization, there's been a substantial increase of a Russian force presence in Ukraine. This suggests a need for caution in the conservation in the conversation on logistics, constraints, and adaptation. Russian ability to sustain forces is an important governing factor worth tracking. That said, there's been an observed decrease in Russian fire rate. Even though Russia was quite late in adjusting to the introduction of HIMARS in June, nonetheless, adjustments were made eventually, and I think this below is probably right. And he refers to the claim from Tatragami that Russian logistical routes have been significantly disrupted multiple times, and it forced them to change ways to deliver supplies. So actually, this is true. HIMARS came along, 84-kilometer range. They said don't keep any depots in 100 kilometers of the front line, although that's still been happening because it's kind of necessary to do that. But the fewer depots, and they've been hit, and so they had to, adjust the way that they got their shells to the front line. Where I differ, says Kaufman, is on the proposition that disruption is being conflated with depletion. They can both be relevant, and Russian artillery use rate relative to available stocks and production rate is the more significant overall, in my view. And I think I would agree with him, but I'm no expert, right? There's been disagreement on how much artillery ammo Russian has available because these are all at best estimates, but most suggest Russia will either have major issues this spring or fall, and either way will have to conserve ammo because use grossly outstrips production. If data suggests that Russia is still supplying ammo at roughly high rates, then it may be analysts are leading the target expecting rationing at this stage. Yet it is difficult to see Russia escaping the basic laws of physics on this one over time. The rationale I see is that ammo availability constrains fires over time, and this in turn restricts offensive potential despite the availability of mass. Meaning Russia can conduct offensive operations, but much more limited in scale than some of the expectations out there. So this would be really interesting. So in at this time where we're expecting both Russia and Ukraine to be conducting counteroffensives, if there at the back of Russia's mind is a conservation of ammo need, then this will curtail the size or possibly even the location, the planning at least of a counteroffensive or an offensive, sorry. So yeah, there are lots of ramifications to this. And if we are seeing major adjustments to Russian tactics at Bakhmut, relying on dismounted infantry, this is absolutely true. So it's all about the troops, very little artillery. There is artillery there, just not to the extent that we've seen it in the past. Why is that? Like at this time when they are really pushing hard, why is the artillery firing at a much lower rate than it was? And we've also heard that they've been getting ammunition from other places to Bakhmut, like taking it from, say, Avdiivka area to get to Bakhmut. These rumors have been around, and that would again feed into the pure lack of ammunition stocks. Um, so relying on dismounted infantry, which Russia has in large supply now, over use of armor or massed artillery fire, it merits asking why that is. Being wary of confirmation bias, of course. Yes, yeah, well said. It is fair to assume that Russia is not going to just run out of ammo. This is what I said the other day. Running out doesn't mean suddenly not having any, right? That is not what running out means in this context. So those pro-Russian voices who go, they're still firing ammunition. They haven't run out. Why do you keep saying that? You've been saying this for a month now. It's like, yeah, I have been saying it because they are running out because they're firing less and less and less and less each subsequent week. They're not going to get to zero because they're still making some and they're still getting some from Iran, maybe, or North Korea. So they're getting some, but they are not at the rate that they want to use it. And so the rate of fire then falls in line with production, and you have just a much smaller scale of offensive use or defensive use of artillery. And that's what running out means here. So, don't build up a straw man argument. So it, uh, so it is fair to assume that Russia is not going to just run out of ammo, but at some point ration employment closer to sustainable rates. That ties into the question of whether the West can supply Ukraine with sufficient relative fire superiority, or if this is an unsound approach. Well, they have ramped up production in a whole bunch of countries, from Bulgaria to I don't know, to a whole number of places. Actually, even I think even places like Australia, so on and so forth. So finally, the conversation on Russian logistics problems, estimated artillery fire rates, and adjustments to disruption in 2022 merits revisiting. It could benefit from a better look at the available evidence to reconcile what strikes me as outstanding issues in analysis. And then Tatragami says, this is all in good faith. Thank you for a good analysis. Always great to have a constructive feedback. Even when we don't agree on certain things, I definitely keep my mind open to substantial analysis such as this. And Kaufman says, and the reason I'm reading this is because this is important in how we debate. Absolutely. And I want to continue the conversation. 2 points that I think we need to clarify. Are we seeing sustained supply of all ammo types, or more specifically 152mm artillery ammunition? Second, is it stable relative to fall or peak use summer 2022? So on and so forth. So the conversation goes on. And I just thought that's a nice bit of how to disagree with someone politely, and then substantiate your arguments, and then say, but feel free to come back at me, and yeah, this is good to disagree. Let's be constructive about it. So I would agree with Kaufman that, yeah, Tatragami, you are right to an extent. There are supply issues, as in logistical issues. Sorry, um, can have something to do with the fire rates going down. Um, but it's not just going to be that, and it will be production issues as well. And it's not either or; it's both and. Uh, but siding more to production issues being the greater causal variable involved in the dwindling fire rates for artillery. Anyway, there you go. Thank you so much for listening to that. Just splurge of stuff. Please like, subscribe, and share. Please check out my interview on A Tippling Philosopher. Link will be down below. On we talked about so many things. My interview with Oris Zub, who's a kind of a YouTuber and an interviewer of people just working full time really on the Ukraine war now. He does absolutely brilliant. Loved it. Really good interview, and so much um, information. Really interesting, useful, historical, contextual, cultural information to throw in to to give us a greater understanding of exactly what is going on in this war. Perfect. So thanks to him, and please check that out. Anyway, thanks again, Toodle Pips. Speak to you tomorrow.